Thank you, Gila, for that very generous introduction and for all the unseen orchestration that makes us coming together possible. Good evening, everyone, or as the case may be in the various time zones assembled here. Good morning, good afternoon, and good insomnia. I wish we were together in a real room, but we are in some kind of digital diaspora gathered in the glow of our separate screens, each of us sitting in our little window, which, come to think of it, is a nice way to speak about Jerusalem's libraries, kind of these windows that open when someone somewhere turns a key. And this evening, I want to wander together with you through some of those windows, some of these hidden archives of Jerusalem, as seen through the lens of my book, Jerusalem, City of the Book, and the remarkable photographs that were taken especially for this project by Frédéric Brenner. We will journey from the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, where access is kind of negotiated like a peace treaty. We're going to go to the Armenian Manuscript Library, to the Khalidi Library, and on through the rescued yeshiva of the Vinograd family. And I hope that we'll have time to also visit the modern sanctuaries, the National Library, the Dead Sea Scrolls Lab. And if this sounds like a sort of adventure story disguised as scholarship, that's because that's exactly what it is. Merav and I began our explorations thinking that we were writing about books. What we found instead is that in Jerusalem, books are just the beginning. They're part of the city's very DNA. And so one theme tonight is access and the lack of access, not just the keys that open up locked libraries, but the ways that that a city can make itself legible through its gatekeepers, through its archivists, and through its guardians. So if our Wi-Fi holds, let's get started. I want to begin with a kind of confession. In a city that's so full of revelation, revelation is actually kind of hard to come by. Um, to see some of Jerusalem's libraries, you need not just curiosity, you also need a whole mountain of patience. Just before we logged on tonight, Gila and I were talking about the inaccessibility of some of these places that we'll talk about. Whereas I think in the West, some of us are used to librarians being those who open up access, who always speak of the democratization of knowledge. In Jerusalem, it's a bit different. I think most of the librarians we encountered were those who wanted to close access and to keep people out. That has various reasons. Sometimes it has to do with the fear, the very real fear of theft. Theft is not something that only takes place in the Louvre. It also has taken place in Jerusalem's most precious libraries. Sometimes it has to do with shame and embarrassment about the state of a community's holdings. And we'll, I hope, find some examples of all of those. Just to give one example, we visited the Islamic collections on top of and beneath the Temple Mount. There's a UNESCO-funded manuscript restoration library up there. And believe it or not, there's a library under Al-Aqsa in the old Herodian passageway that used to go from the southern gates of the old city up to the plaza. And beneath Al-Aqsa, there's an Islamic library. To get access to those places, we had to get written permission from the Waqf, the Muslim religious trust that administers that site. And letters were drafted and delivered and redelivered, and weeks and months passed. And at last, word finally arrived that Sheikh Azam, who's the Director General of the Islamic Trust, had granted us entry. But even then, we sensed that access was very, very provisional, and that a door was opening to us that was very, very provisional. Another example before we really get started is the Ethiopian Orthodox Christian uh, Library, which is on Ethiopia or Abyssinia Street in Jerusalem. where finally one of the monks gestured toward this heavy door behind which was the library and said simply to us, the patriarch must decide. And that decision, we learned, could only be made in Addis Ababa. So Merav had to board a plane and found herself in a small office in Addis where the Ethiopian patriarch, after a long pause, finally pressed a wax seal onto a letter. We brought that letter back to Jerusalem, and that same letter opened the door. So, in a sense, permission is a kind of pilgrimage, and every signature that grants permission is a station along the way of that pilgrimage. The Armenian Patriarchate demanded a whole nother kind of choreography of trust. It turns out that to the treasury of the Armenian Patriarchate, three separate keys are held by three separate officials. And they have to meet at the same time. It's like this nuclear code kind of feeling to open the drawer to the manuscript treasury. Um, over time, we understood that these encounters and permission seeking, these were not delays to our work. They were the work itself. And then as we progressed, a deeper pattern revealed itself. And it's a pattern that I want to return to. And that is that we had the sense that this is a city that's the traditional way of telling this of the city is of conquest and reconquest. But it's also a city that's been written and erased and rewritten, and we called it a palimpsest in script and in stone. A palimpsest, of course, is when you have one text overwritten on an earlier text. And reading Jerusalem is sort of like deciphering a palimpsest. The palimpsest does not erase memory. It doesn't erase the lower level of writing so much as it recycles it or it appropriates it. And we learn to read Jerusalem as a kind of conversation between languages, a palimpsest in which writers and communities are reaching for each other across the centuries. The final thing I'll say by way of framing our journeys through the city is that we found that each of the city's communities has its own diaspora and is very conscious of that diaspora. And each in turn practices a kind of ingathering, a return not just of people, but of manuscripts, material culture, and memories. And for each of the communities that we visited, books that once wandered in exile found their way back, like kind of like homing pigeons of culture. And in this way, we began to see Jerusalem less as a kind of fixed point on a map than a whole gravitational field of writing. Everything that once scattered outward from Jerusalem tends to bend backwards toward it. So our first stop lies just a few minutes down from Jaffa Gate, although it might as well be centuries away. And that's the first example I want to talk to you about is the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate Library. As befits the city's wealthiest and most powerful Christian institution, that library is a vast universe in and of itself. To describe its immensity, one of the archbishops told us, "Day will be night, and night will be day, and you will grow old there." Now, when Merav and I first sought entry to this place, we were firmly turned away. And the Archbishop, Aristarchos, was courteous but final. And he said, "No, not after Uspensky." Okay, so Merav and I leave this meeting, and I said, "Who or what is Uspensky? And why is this why we're being barred?" And it turns out that we had stepped unknowingly into a wound that's more than 100 years old, because it turns out that in the 1840s and 50s, a bibliophile and scholar of very formidable energy but very dubious scruple named Porphyrius Uspensky had persuaded the Greeks to let him examine some of their treasures. And he left Jerusalem with trunks full of manuscripts, gospels and commentaries and hymns that were never returned and found their way instead to St. Petersburg, where they remain to this day in the Imperial Library. Among them was the celebrated Codex Sinaiticus, the earliest complete New Testament. And to the people that we talked to in that community, these losses were not academic, they were desecrations. And this too was a kind of theft, not of territory, not of land, but of language. And what's incredible is that more than a century later, suspicion was still clinging to this place. The people in the Patriarchate have long memories. They're custodians not just of manuscripts, but also of grievances. So Merav and I returned several times. We were bearing letters of introduction and credentials. And finally, Archbishop Aristarchos, who's in charge of the library, agreed to admit us. And we were reminded on that day that in Jerusalem, entry or access is never a right. It's always a relationship. And that relationship is renewed each time the hinge of the door swings open. So after many months of this anticipation, finally we heard that Aristarchos and the Patriarch Theophilus had consented to show us the manuscript library. Theophilus was elected Patriarch in 2005, and he and Aristarchos stood at this sort of small desk in the center of a domed room in very sort of gray light, and he gestured at the collections that were brought to this library, um, uh, some of which were in Syriac, in Palestinian Aramaic, in Greek, in Arabic, brought from the desert monastery of Marsaba, 640 manuscripts that originated in a library that was called the Library of the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre. And I want to show you Frédéric's image of that. Just bear with me as I learn how to do as I learn how to get these up for you. Hold on a second. There it is. Share screen. There we go. My share screening is paused. Okay, hold on. Let me try that again. Sorry for this technical delay. I'm not sure why, but my screen sharing is paused. Okay. This worked before when we were trying it out. Sorry about this. Hmm. Okay, one more try.
If you want to, you can try send them to me and I can share them.
Let's see one more time. Okay, is that coming up?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is Frédéric Brenner's photograph of Patriarch Theophilus on the right of the screen and the librarian Aristarchos on the left. You can see from this image that this is not really a library that's meant to be used, right? It is a library for preservation, but it's almost never accessed by anyone. And they had to bring in this desk just for this photograph. Uh, Now, one of the library's most well-known manuscript is actually a literal palimpsest. It's called the palimpsest, the Jerusalem palimpsest of Euripides. The top layer is a 556-page text of the 16 prophets in the Septuagint version. It dates from around 1300. And below that are pages of a lost play by the Greek tragedian Euripides from 4 centuries earlier. And the Greeks in the Patriarchate have been translating and retranslating scripture here since the Crusades. Translation becomes, one of the city's earliest forms of hospitality, the art of making room for another language within your own. Um, and as a reward for uh, I'll just pull up another image. I'll prepare one for you. Um, it was very important for us to keep the relationship to Theophilus. And this is when we presented the patriarch with our book. Um, and he had many, many critiques of our book, especially that we gave equal prominence to the Greeks and their rivals, the Armenians. He wasn't quite happy about that. Um, so let's shift for a moment to the Armenian Patriarchate Library to cross into Jerusalem's most self-contained neighborhood of cloistered courtyards. The Armenians have been here since the 4th century. It's their oldest continuous diaspora community outside of Armenia. And they really keep faith with Jerusalem by keeping faith with their books. Within the walls of the Armenian Quarter is one of the largest collections of Armenian manuscripts anywhere in the world. Books that trace this people's passage through exile, through refuge, through loss. And one of the parts of that library is 4,000 manuscripts that belong to a library called the St. Toros Library. Toros is Theodore in Armenian. Which is hidden away inside a 13th century church called the Church of St. Taurus. And I'll pull up an image from there. Again, I beg your indulgence. Uh, Almost no one is allowed in this place. And this is Frédéric Brenner's image of the interior of the manuscript library. Again, it has no electricity. We had to roll in a electricity line cable just to be able to take these photographs. And it's obviously not a site which is opens itself or encourages visitors. But finally, with the help of Father Paloyan, we were able to access it. And he ushered us into that room to see the oldest illuminated manuscript in Jerusalem. It's a gospel on parchment. Its margins are really sort of coming alive with peacocks and all kinds of improbable creatures. And one scholar named Professor Maksudian dates it to the 8th century, making it, as I said, the oldest illuminated codex in the city. And let me try to pull up that image if I can. Just so you have an idea of what the oldest manuscript looks like. So, even here, not everything can be trusted to the St. Toros sanctuary. The most precious works are kept elsewhere in the treasury, which I mentioned before. And to see those, we were granted an audience with the patriarch Manugian, who's been patriarch since 2013. And before he talks to us about books, he's really talking to us about his community, about how his community endured here amid dwindling numbers. He himself tells us that he's born in Aleppo. And he tells us about the peril that has followed his own family. And finally, when we talk about the treasures in the treasury, he explained to us that these treasures are never entrusted to any one person, right? There's three keys held by two senior monks and one lay representative, and they all have to be there. And custody becomes this whole ritual of shared responsibility. Um, Inside of that treasury, one of the things that it protects is one of Jerusalem's masterpieces. It's called the Queen Kiran Gospels, um, illuminated in the 13th century. And here again, we have a story of theft. Two of its leaves were torn away in 1910. They vanished into some collector's trove overseas. And 101 years later, those pages were restored, returned to the Jerusalem community as a kind of act of rescue and restitution. And here the metaphor of palimpsest deepens. It's no longer just a matter of overwritten text or layered scripts, but really of custody itself, rewriting possession through loss and through recovery. And here we have, also ingathering making its appearance. All these volumes in the manuscript library came from monasteries in um, Armenia that were destroyed during the genocide. They come from Istanbul, from Tehran, from Isfahan, all of them finding refuge here in Jerusalem. And the sense that we had is that this library becomes kind of a harbor for exiled texts. Um, and these librarians hold in their hands what can't be lost if the community is to continue to remember itself. They understood that the written word is the most important architecture of home. The third example I want to share with you is only a few hundred steps away is the Khalidi Library. Um, and the Khalidiya, as Jerusalemites call it, is the oldest Arab library in the city. It was founded in 1900 by a circle of jurists and scholars who wanted to make learning itself a Waqf. Learning itself became a perpetual endowment. Um, the building that they chose had a history worthy of its new purpose. It began as a Mamluk mausoleum. It was a tomb of a warrior in the army of Salah ad-Din. And this family repurposed it as a house for the living word. Um, Among its founders, for example, was Ruhi al-Khalidi, a diplomat and scholar who had studied in Paris and lectured at the Sorbonne, wrote one of the earliest studies in Arabic of European political thought. And when he came back to Jerusalem, he brought his books with him, a sort of homecoming of words. And um, by the time of its founding, the Khalidi Library already held 1,200 manuscripts, 5,000 printed volumes. We're talking about Quranic commentaries and works of jurisprudence and astronomy and treatises on medicine and Sufi reflections and family documents going back to the 11th century. And what was most remarkable, what sort of caught my eye, was that they kept all this time, since 1900, a visitor's book. It was now very brittle, but each name was uh, sort of marked a kind of crossing. There were people there coming to the library from Cairo and Damascus and Beirut, all converging in this narrow Jerusalem alley. And that guest book became, in my eyes, a sort of palimpsest of its own. It has since been digitized. You can see it online. And it's really a map of friendships across the late Ottoman world. Now, our guide to the library was the librarian named Khader Salameh. Khader was the former librarian of the Al-Aqsa libraries that I mentioned before. And again, if you indulge me for a second, I'll bring up Frédéric's portrait of him that was taken on the Temple Mount. Just a moment. There we go. That's Khader, next to the Islamic Museum, which is itself next to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Uh, and he's an award-winning librarian, as I said. He got tired of working with the Islamic Waqf. He felt that they didn't appreciate his skills, and so he ended up being the librarian of the Khalidi Library. Uh, Now, the next image that I would like to show with you is a remarkable manuscript that he brought out for us. You're looking at a poem in Arabic that can be read various ways depending on which branch of the verses you follow. Uh, Remarkable about this manuscript is that it was dated in it was written in the year 1201. It was presented to Salah ad-Din's family in tribute to his victory, and its title is almost as ornate as the illumination itself. The title of this manuscript is "The Spacious Lands of Commendations and the Garden of the Glorious and Praiseworthy Deeds among the Merits of the Victorious King." Even its name is a kind of literary uh, procession. Now, in Khader's description, the library's endurance feels itself almost miraculous because it actually shares on the other side of the same building. The back of the building is the yeshiva of Rabbi Goren, which overlooks the Kotel Plaza, the Western Wall Plaza. And after the 1967 war, that became disputed property. The state sought to claim the Khalidis' building as quote unquote absentee property. And there was a court fight that took place over decades. Um, and today, the library stands open again. Its manuscripts are digitized. And Khader told us that he still feels the presence of the scholars who founded this place in 1900. He said he still feels their hands on the margins and their breath on the page. So if the Greek library, we saw that translation could be a form of hospitality, and in the Armenian treasury, that memory could serve as a kind of sanctuary. Here in the Khalidi library, we saw the possibility that scholarship itself can become a kind of endurance. And the motto of this library might well be a motto of Jerusalem itself. And the motto of the library is to read is also in the Old City, also in the Muslim Quarter, but it begins not in the Old City. Our path to this library begins in Rehavia, where we met a distinguished man and scholar named Yeshayahu Vinograd, who received us in his modest apartment. Bookshelves were lining every wall, halachic treatises, Talmudic commentaries, the furniture of a scholar's life. Vinograd, who only passed away relatively recently, was Jerusalem's preeminent Hebrew bibliographer. And among the things that he showed us from his own shelves, and you could write a whole separate book about the libraries of Rehavia and the Yekis, etc. But he pulled down a Hebrew translation of Euclid's Elements that was published in The Hague in 1780 at the instructions of the Vilna Gaon. A reminder that, for the Jewish mind, geometry too could be a form of devotion. And I'd like to pull that up for a moment to see what Euclid looks like in a Hebrew of 1780. Okay. That's an image from Vinograd's Euclid, as if Euclidean geometry wasn't difficult enough. Uh, now, I'll tell you the reason why we came there. We came there to hear the story of his great-grandfather, Rabbi Yitzchak Vinograd, who was one of the early Zionists drawn to Jerusalem, who arrived in 1886, bought a small plot in the Old City, and founded what became the Torat Chaim Yeshiva in 1894. Everything was fine until the Arab revolt in the mid-1930s. The school was forced to close, the students to evacuate, and during the 1948 war, as the Jewish quarter fell, Torat Chaim was the only one of that quarter's 80 synagogues and yeshivot that was not destroyed. And its survival owed nothing to its fortifications, but everything to one person's faith. It turns out that we had heard that the yeshiva's Arab caretaker, whose name was Ibrahim Basha, had hid its 3,000 books from the Beit Midrash by plastering them behind a false wall before the Jordanians could enter. For 19 years, he kept that secret. And when Israeli forces recaptured the quarter in 1967, Yeshayahu Vinograd returned to that site, which is on current-day Al-Wad Street, accompanied by then Major General Chaim Herzog, later Israel's president. And Vinograd told us he could hardly believe what he saw when they returned to that place and removed the plaster and found that the shelves were thick with dust, the bindings were still intact. Herzog would later say that this rediscovery was among the most moving moments of his return to the liberated quarter. Now, interestingly, Vinograd could not remember the name of this Arab caretaker. So sometime after our conversation with Vinograd, Merav and I went to the Old City. It happened to be the first day of Ramadan. It was also the morning after Jerusalem Day. So the whole Muslim quarter was sort of half asleep in the heat. We found the yeshiva easily enough. It's today leased to the Ateret Kohanim organization. And you do what you do in Jerusalem. You start asking shopkeepers, do they know about the former caretakers? And one of us said, of course, and he pointed us around the corner, and we knocked on the door. And after a moment's hesitation, a woman named Dina Al-Basha invited us into her family's apartment, which is in the same building as the present-day Ateret Kohanim Yeshiva. It's an amazing microcosm in and of itself. So from her windows of her apartment, you can see the yeshiva students climbing the stairs to the Beit Midrash. And we explained why we had come. She nodded. She was not really surprised. She was a bit touched that anyone still remembered. And she said, hold on a moment. And she came back and she brought a small portrait of her father, Ibrahim, and placed it beside her on the couch. And I want to show you what that moment looked like. This is going to be my photograph rather than Frédéric's in this case. Again, just give me a moment. There we go. And that's Dina Al-Basha with a photograph of her father, who was the caretaker who saved the Vinograd library, telling us his story. She told us that her father, among other things, had been a very respected educator and teacher, but that he had always spoken very quietly about those years of caretaking. Yes, she said, this is a quote from our conversation. My father told us he was watching over the books of the Jews. He said, they are sacred too. You don't throw away words. And that to me sounded like the sentence of a true librarian, although Ibrahim never had that title. Um, so there we have it. A Palestinian father seals a wall to protect Jewish books. His daughter remembers the father's fidelity, and between them, Jerusalem's story gathered itself again. And this points to how sometimes the people of Jerusalem become custodians of one another's memory. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to accelerate, and I just have another example, and then we can open up to your questions. And I think that if you type them in to our chat, then Gila will be as kind enough to offer to moderate and gather some of your questions. The last example that's unavoidable, of course, is the National Library of Israel. Um, and there's a lot to say about the National Library, but of course, it now occupies a new and glorious building. It was moved from the Givat Ram campus of Hebrew University, and in moving became it was transformed from this sort of academic scholarly place to a true national institution. I happened to visit the National Library several times, but one of the times I visited the new library was just weeks after October 7th. And the reading room was reopened by that time, but there was a different kind of hush there. And that day, the library's atrium became a place of vigil because they installed an exhibition there called Each Hostage Has a Story. Some of you may have seen it, in which they set up chairs, rows of chairs, each chair bearing a portrait of a hostage and a book that the family had told them was meaningful to that hostage. The most heartbreaking, of course, was a high chair for Kfir Bibas, who at that time was, of course, still missing, his fate unknown. And it had a copy of a book that I've brought to show, which is by the poet Leah Goldberg. It's called Aye Pluto. Where is Pluto? It was laid gently on this chair. And what's remarkable is that I took a look at this book, and at the end of the book, it's about a dog who goes astray. And at the end of the book are the lines, Chazarta habaita ezo simcha. You're home again, what joy. Now, the National Library has long imagined itself as Israel's kind of ark. It's an instrument of preservation. Um, and the new building, which rises between the Knesset and the Israel Museum, performs this amazing um, choreography of concentric reading rooms descending to these subterranean vaults, all of it culminating in this oculus of daylight above. Um, and yet, behind all this architecture is a conviction that's much older than the new building. And that conviction is that the National Library's mission is a mission of ingathering, of returning what exile has dispersed. So you can find there Torah scrolls from Yemen. You can find the Damascus crown. You can find rabbinic responsa from Salonika. You can find the notebooks of Shai Agnon and Leah Goldberg, the archives of Martin Buber and Gershom Scholem. It's a whole cartography of the Jewish diaspora there. Um, but to bring home is also to make a claim, and to make a claim is to risk appropriation. And that paradox surfaced, to my mind, with incredible force in another drama that I wrote about elsewhere in a book called Kafka's Last Trial. And that's a 9-year battle, international trial over Kafka's manuscripts. Which basically revolved around the question, who owns Kafka? Was it a private family? Was it Germany? After all, Kafka wrote in German and had never stepped foot in Jerusalem. And that's a trial that I followed all the way up to the Supreme Court. Um, and in a way, that courtroom became a stage where diaspora and homeland kind of collided. One of the judges of the Supreme Court said in the opinion, quote, certain cultural assets belong to the people of Israel and to the Jewish world, and um, and not to private owners. Another judge mentioned Kafka's request that his writings be burned and concluded that the world had done well to disobey Kafka once and now must do it again for the sake of preservation of Jewish memory. And this logic of rescue in Jerusalem has very, very deep roots. So after the Shoah, there was a whole project that gathered together fragments of orphaned European Jewish libraries and brought them back to Jerusalem. And the library became a kind of secular geniza, if you will, as this act of salvage. And the Kafka ruling just extended that logic into modern literature. It was a state asserting cultural patrimony draped in the language of guardianship. And yet, what's interesting, as I wrote in the Kafka book, the Israeli assumption that Kafka's manuscript belonged in Jerusalem reflected a sense that Jerusalem is the culmination, the proper culmination of a story that begins elsewhere. So even though you might say there's no one more diasporic than Kafka, no one more, who spoke more deeply of alienation, uh, and who wasn't himself a Zionist, by the way, to say that his work, that his legacy and heritage belong in Jerusalem is to assert this very interesting claim that Jerusalem is the proper ending of stories that begin elsewhere. We saw that with the Ethiopians who told us stories of how many of the manuscripts in their library were brought on the backs of pilgrims who walked from Ethiopia to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. We saw that with the Armenian manuscripts that made their way from Armenia and from Armenian exile communities to Jerusalem, and we saw it in virtually every place that where we set foot. Um, the National Library pledged to digitize every page, to make the manuscripts of Kafka universally accessible. And that only deepens, in a way, the paradox, right? In an age when text can be everywhere, what does it mean to say that a book belongs somewhere? Um, so uh, through all of this, there's this paradox that books, like Jerusalem itself, are subject to claims of possession, often very posthumous claims of possession. Uh, Let me just introduce one more example, and then we'll, with Gila's help, open up the conversation. And that's an example that brings us to the modern age. Merav and I were able to visit the Dead Sea Scrolls laboratory in the basement of the Israel Museum, a place where, parchment learns how to survive. Now, as you know, we're not going to tell the whole story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which survived for 2 millennia in the Judean desert. But what we can say is that once they were removed from that climate and brought to Jerusalem, the scrolls began to decay. And starting in the Rockefeller Museum, which Gila and I were talking about earlier. And they were working with the best tools of their day, but they were just pressing these fragments between glass and they were joining edges with adhesive tape. And instead of healing these manuscripts, they actually hastened the harm of these manuscripts. Today, in this conservation lab, scientists are working in this very sterile sanctum. And the centerpiece of that lab, built in partnership with imaging experts from Caltech and from King's College London, is a set of cameras designed by a former NASA scientist named Greg Bierman. And they photograph each fragment of the scrolls across multiple wavelengths, visible to ultraviolet to infrared. And in effect, they're translating what's illegible back into text. To consider just one small example, there's one fragment of a scroll called the Genesis Apocryphon, and this lab was able, through this imaging techniques, to make legible new words from the book of Genesis, phrases that were invisible since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that emerged only with a certain wavelength of infrared light. In another instance, the imaging restored a missing line where the word or light can now be read. And these letters were, in a way, an enactment of Jerusalem's metaphor that I want to, return to. They're turning what had been lost into something legible. And standing in that lab and seeing some of these letters materialize from what the naked eye could only see as dust, I thought this is, in a sense, what revelation in Jerusalem can mean. It's not something thunderous. It's not something, that's accompanied by flame, but it's a very quiet disclosure of pixels. And here too, the lab has made all of this available to anyone with an internet connection, thereby sparing the originals from the damage of touch. Um, so that's another journey that takes place in Jerusalem, from the caves of Qumran to the vault, and now to the digital cloud. These words can still be read. Let me just finish by summing up some of these examples amount to. How does Jerusalem read itself? First, as a palimpsest, as layers of text responding to each other. Second, as a form of ingathering. And third, as a form of custody and of preservation. I want to close just one more minute not to take too much of your time, but I want to close with two poets who met here in Jerusalem in 1969. The names were Paul Celan and Yehuda Amichai. Celan was a survivor of the Shoah. He wrote a poem called Say That Jerusalem Is. It's not a statement, it's an act of faith. To say that Jerusalem is to keep it alive through utterance. Now, he met, when he was here, the Jerusalem poet Yehuda Amichai, who answered Celan with the following lines in his poem. He wrote this: "The air over Jerusalem is saturated with prayers and dreams. Like the air over industrial cities, it's hard to breathe." And elsewhere, Amichai adds, "We indeed are the people of the book, but we have to write it again and again, for each of us is a letter." Between these two poets and between these two poems of Celan and Amichai, of saying that Jerusalem is, and rewriting ourselves as a people of the book, there, I think that's where Jerusalem can be seen. It's a city of perpetual revision, always being rewritten and never complete. So thank you for your patience with all of that. And now, with Gila's help, we can start a conversation.
I love that. Thank you so much for your very illuminating presentation, and especially seeing those pictures that we otherwise wouldn't have had access to. So much effort has gone into the making of this book. I read it and I saw how much work has gone into it. And some people were just wondering, how much time did it take you to gather all this information and do all the research? How much preparation went into this? And also, how did you decide what goes in and what goes out?
Oh, that's a great question. It took about 4 years of research. But again, a lot of that time, I mean, what's good is that while you're waiting for permission and access from one community, you can be granted it from the other. So for one example, while we were waiting for access to the Greek collection, we finally did get access to the Ethiopian collection, and I forgot, but I want to show you just one image from there, if I may, so you can have an idea, because I didn't share anything from the Ethiopians, but just to give an idea of what their custodians, how they treat their illuminated manuscript. This is a 17th century manuscript that is written in Ge'ez and was brought from Ethiopia to Jerusalem. So yeah, the whole process took about 4 years in stops and starts. Yeah.
Wow. And somebody was just wondering about the caretaker Ibrahim. Was he honored in any special way or recognized for preserving all of those books in the Old City?
No, as far as I know, outside of our book, he's never been recognized, acknowledged, or otherwise honored.
Wow.
And I hope that our book is a small restitution uh, to that remarkable story.
Um, are there any libraries that were excluded that you didn't put in that are in Jerusalem?
Uh, yes, let's see. Um, Look, there are a lot of private libraries in Rehavia, as I mentioned, that are worthy of their own treatments. The most famous of which is the library of the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, Gershom Scholem. That's the only library to this day that is kept intact as a discrete collection in the National Library of Israel. You can take down some of his books and you can see his marginal comments written in some of them. They're often very angry, in which he says, this scholar took this idea, borrowed this idea from me, and in any case, I said it more eloquently. We didn't include that. We didn't include Shai Agnon's library, which also exists in his former residence in Talpiot. There was yeah, there are a lot of things that we couldn't include. Some things we couldn't include simply for legal reasons. So, for example, many of you may have read Mati Friedman's book on the Aleppo Codex. Uh, we had to be careful when treating that because we were granted access to a library in the Talbiya neighborhood here in Jerusalem, where the missing pages of that codex may to this day be. It now belongs to the Benayahu family. Um, but the problem is that Meir Benayahu, who was the who may have been responsible for stealing these pages, we had to be very careful given given the legal aspects of that. But we were he you know his grandson was very obliging with us.
Okay, wow. And so, with all of those sensitivities of Jerusalem, was it tough for you to navigate and not be brought into ideological and theological fault lines? How did you find it challenging to actually write and navigate between all of these things?
Well, as I said, it had to do with a sense that in many cases, and not just in the Vinograd case, there were examples of institutions or people conserving other people's memories, so to speak. So none of the libraries that we visited are, so to speak, linguistically pure. They're all, none of them are homogeneous. And they all contain many different languages, sometimes, as I say, in the same page, sometimes in different pages. Um, so what we found is that we could um, bridge, so to speak, these hatreds and rivalries. And by the way, some of the greatest rivalries are within, let's say, the Christian communities. Um, Not just the obvious Arab-Jewish rivalries. To bridge those rivalries was to say, okay, look what you have in common. Look what, look at the ways that you are dedicated to your texts, to the memories of your material heritage. Look at the ways in which you can learn from one another um, in preservation. So just to give you an example, we write in the book about a remarkable archive at a place in Mea Shearim called Kolel Galicia. Kolel Galicia had no means to digitize its collections, and we helped put them in touch with a specialist who happens to be at the École Biblique. He's Christian. So there was this sort of idea that a Haredi institution in Mea Shearim could learn from the expertise of a digitization expert who is Catholic. Okay, and that's just one small example. We also found that there are, despite these similarities and affinities, there are also great divides. So, for example, the librarian of the Ethiopian Orthodox community mentioned almost in passing that he had never visited the National Library. He spent almost his entire career in Jerusalem as a custodian of texts. He had no idea that there were important Ge'ez texts in the Ge'ez language being preserved by the National Library. The National Library's curators must, for professional reasons and to do their jobs fully and with integrity, they have to partner with all these other institutions, Islamic and Christian, to preserve their own collections in various languages. So yeah, I would say that there are by looking at Jerusalem in this way, rather than in the traditional way of disputes over territory, we were able to find some hopeful connections.
That's so wonderful. So I guess in that sense, preservation, just checking. Are you able to, did you hear what I said?
No, can you repeat the last question?
So in a way, the digitization is bringing honor to the old books, but and giving them a chance to be preserved. But does this have a tension with access to people who are gatekeeping and not being able to preserve because of the state that they're in? What is the role of digitization and preservation with those accessibility and keeping things behind closed doors?
So that's a great question, and I'll answer it with a very brief example of a library that exists only in digital form, and that's the Karliner Hasidic Library in Jerusalem. Merav, Frédéric, and I were able to get an audience, so to speak, with a Karliner Rebbe. Their library from before the war was almost entirely destroyed and lost. And that trauma persists to the present day. So in rebuilding and reconstituting their library here in Jerusalem, that library is entirely inaccessible. Only one person can consult that library, and that's the Karliner Rebbe himself. And we asked, why don't you allow other people to go there? And he said, well, we digitize everything. So why would there be a need for people to visit the physical volumes? And so that's a wonderful example of how digitization has combined with the trauma of loss to, in a sense, create a whole new relationship to what it means to be a library, and that, of all places, happens in this Haredi community.
So interesting. Well, thank you so much for giving us your extra layer. And your book is adding another layer. And did you put it in the National Library?
It's there, yes, yes. The book is there.